Harvey. I'm working with Edge Funders Alliance to help develop the Just Transition Collaborative and also the Global Engagement Lab. And I'll explain in a minute a little bit more about what those two things are. But first, I wanted to welcome you all so much to this conversation on framing the systems change debate. And I also want to especially welcome our 4 speakers. I'll introduce them in more depth as we go through the webinar. But just to say hello, we're being joined by Michael Leon Guerrero, who is calling in from Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's with the Labor Network for Sustainability. Then we'll hear from Edouard Marina, who's with the University of London Institute in Paris. And finally, we'll hear from Laura Rapira and Marianne Elliott, who are with Action Station in New Zealand. So actually, Laura and Marianne deserve an extra special hello and warm welcome because they are calling us from 4 in the morning tomorrow. So that's definitely commitment. Thank you, Marianne and Laura. And we certainly have a global suite of speakers today. Thank you all for joining us. So quickly, just a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll give a little bit of background on EDGE and the Just Transition Collaborative and the Global Engagement Lab, and then I'll kick it over to Michael. So first, the housekeeping. You probably see a chat box, and in my screen, it's on the right side of the screen, or maybe it's on the bottom. You can click on chat. So please type your questions in there if you have a question throughout the webinar, and then we'll get to questions and answers at the end. So I'll go through the questions at the end. So click for your chat box. You're muted now. If for some reason your chat box isn't working and you have a burning question toward the end, you can unmute yourself and just get in there, but try to use the chat box, please. This webinar is being recorded, so we've reserved 90 minutes for it, but we realize that's a long time. So we're gonna try to get through all of the presentations within an hour, and the last half hour will be for questions and answers. So if you need to jump off after an hour, just rest assured it's being recorded. So you can go on our website and find it later. Yeah, so we'll have about 10 minutes for each speaker, and then I'll ask them a couple of questions and they'll have conversation among the 4 of them, and then we'll open it up to questions. So that's the housekeeping. And now just a little bit of background on EDGE and how we got here. I know many of you are very familiar with EDGE, but I think it bears repeating. So I'm in New York City, and actually Mark Randazzo, the director of EDGE, and Masoom Mamaya, who's the new North American director, are in New York this week. And we were talking yesterday about how July 1st is EDGE's 5th birthday. They were reminding me of that. I actually didn't know. And we were talking about kind of the development of the Just Transition Collaborative and this work through EDGE. So since the beginning, EDGE has been a unique funder space in 3 ways. One, in that it's cross-sectoral. So EDGE has always been for funders with movements. So even though it's for a philanthropic audience, we've always taken our leads and gathered our information and shared across sectors with movement groups, civil society groups, and academia. So it's cross-sectoral. EDGE is also a global audience. So we're not just based in the US, we're not just based in Europe, although those are the majority of our memberships. We're a global audience. We work with movement partners around the world and also funders around the world. So we're also cross-border, and we're also cross-issue. We're always, from the beginning, EDGE has been intersectional. So talking about the overlapping economic and ecological crises, but also looking at overlapping opportunities that the intersections of issues present. And it's not uncommon to come into an EDGE space and hear somebody talking about gender justice, economic justice, fresh water, and capitalism all in the same conversation. So EDGE is cross-borders, cross-sector, and cross-issue. And we've developed this strategy through our conferences, our webinars, our delegations to movement spaces and philanthropic and political spaces. And through all of this, the underlying conversation, or maybe overarching conversation of EDGE, has always been, how do we dismantle the old and build the new? And by the old, we mean the extractive economy. And by the new, we mean, and this is where today's webinar comes in, what do we mean when we talk about the new? Because when we agree that we need to build the new, we then kind of open up this whole other beautiful can of worms of how do we come to the same or similar conclusions or shared values around what the new is really going to look like. What do we mean when we say just transitions? What do we mean when we say systems change? And with the world changing rapidly around us, answers to these questions have not only become more complex, but more urgent to find. So through all of this development at EDGE, we started to see the need for a learning and strategy building community that's a little bit more formal, a little bit more directed than just the conferences and the webinars and the blog posts and all these great things that EDGE has been doing, but we wanted to make it a little bit more formalized. And here comes the Just Transition Collaborative, which is launching today. It's drawn from the work that the EDGE community, that all of you have done with us over the past 5 years, and also drawn from conversations and partnerships with movements and civil society partners. So the Just Transition Collaborative is this overarching focus. And then as far as my work goes, I was a program officer at the Overbrook Foundation for many years. And I met Mark Randazzo through the B Initiative, which I was working on. It's Building Equity and Alignment for Impact. It was an initiative in the US to break down borders between funders, grassroots, and what we call big green groups, and also shift resources to the grassroots organizing sector. And then through that work, which was very complementary with a lot of the work that EDGE was doing, I joined the EDGE board, and then ultimately ended up stepping down from my position at Overbrook, and Overbrook Foundation is supporting me in a fellowship with EDGE to work on the Just Transition Collaborative. So over the past couple of months, one of the things that I've been doing that's been really fascinating is a series of interviews with funders, starting with the EDGE community of funders, and just asking people, what terminology do you use? What's your vocabulary? So do you talk about just transition? Do you talk about systems change? Do you talk about buen vivir, the commons, circular economy, ecofeminism? What is the terminology that you're using? And then also asking funders, once they talk about that terminology and vocabulary, what are some of the values and principles that underpin that vocabulary? And it's been pretty interesting that, I ask all the funders basically the same questions and the conversation goes where it will. But what's been pretty interesting is that unsolicited, the majority of funders I'm talking to say that they're sick of purism, that they have their vocabulary for very clear reasons, but they'd really like to drop that. And what they really need is a strategy and kind of help teasing out the shared values that we have across borders and across sectors. So under the umbrella of the Just Transition Collaborative, we're also launching today what we're calling a Global Engagement Lab. And I believe Luciana is going to put the link for that in the chat box at some point. But the Global Engagement Lab will be a 6-month targeted intensive process for a cohort of funders, so a group of about 20 funders from around the world. And we're going to launch it in November with an in-person meeting in France. And then we'll close it up in April with an in-person meeting in the United States before the EDGE Funders Conference in April. And within those 6 months, we'll have peer-to-peer learning across borders with funders. We will be developing a funder guide for funder craft. We'll be working with movement partners and civil society partners and academics to basically figure out what it is we're actually talking about when we use these words, and understanding that systems change is an evolution. It's not one static thing that you can just say, okay, we achieved it. It's going to be changing and evolving as we go. But the underpinning values and principles are probably more, won't change as much as the contexts and the political situations that we find ourselves in. So we're really trying to tease out these things that bring us together. The Global Engagement Lab also has a living curriculum, which means that the EDGE staff will develop curriculum, present it to the first cohort, and then the cohort has the ability to shift it to say that they want to focus on one part as opposed to another, and they have the ability to change it as we go. So we're really excited. This is going to be again, a cross-sector and living, breathing group coming together to really dig in intensively on systems change and just transition. Before I kick it over to Michael, I'll just say one more thing. You're all aware that the term just transition was placed into the Paris Accord about 1.5 years ago. And what was interesting to me, I was lucky enough to be in Paris, and I was in some of the funder spaces, and a lot of funders were really excited about that and high-fiving, yes, Just Transition finally made it to a mainstream audience. And then I stepped into the movement spaces, and a lot of the movement folks were holding their heads in their hands, and they thought, oh God, now it's going to be co-opted, and this is a term that came out of movements, and now funders are jumping on board, and it's in this international policy arena, and how do we make sure that what we meant when we established that term remains true? So this is actually, I think, a great opportunity, and the reason for the Just Transition Collaborative work through EDGE, a really great opportunity for a group of funders with partners across sectors to dig into what these things mean and make sure that we're really building solidarity and building strategy together across the globe and across sectors and across issues. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I will kick it over to Michael, but let me give him a little bit more of a fleshed out introduction. Michael Leon Guerrero is the Executive Director of the Labor Network for Sustainability. It was founded in 2009 in part to dismantle the jobs versus environment frame, looking at the confluence of climate, economic justice, civil rights, and democracy. Michael is based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and before his post at Labor Network for Sustainability, he was the national coordinator of the Climate Justice Alliance. So Michael is going to share some of the background of the terminology and also has a really unique perspective on the labor and environment links. So Michael, if you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sam. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So I just want to thank Sam again and Luciana and EDGE funders. Congratulations also on the launching of the Global Engagement Lab and the Just Transition Collaborative. It's great to see how EDGE funders has really evolved over these last few years and all the great work that you all are doing. Just a little bit more on my background, the journey to how I ended up on this call. My background is actually community-based organizing. I started here in New Mexico doing work primarily on environmental justice, and which meant that we worked with local communities on issues of health and safety and environmental impacts from polluting industries. That evolved into environmental and economic justice. We were very involved in the late 1980s and early 90s as the environmental justice movement really started to grow and evolve. And then also that led us into work on globalization issues. NAFTA primarily was a big struggle for us that got us involved in terms of globalization and global politics. I left the Southwest Organizing Project in 2004 to help found the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which several of you are familiar with, which helped to connect grassroots communities in the US with global social movements. And it was in that context that things kind of came full circle, because more and more during the course of the last decade, global social movements were really looking at climate as a major issue, but also from the economic justice lens, and the whole concept of the green economy and what that really meant, and how we develop sustainable communities, and the tensions between capitalist economic policies and development and globalization, and what we were trying to build at the grassroots level. So coming back, I ended up joining the team at the Climate Justice Alliance. I was a national coordinator for a couple of years. We worked on the People's Climate March and other initiatives. And last September, I started with the Labor Network for Sustainability. So my background is not in trade unionism. It's in community organizing and environmental justice. But also, part of the reason why I felt it was important to join the team here at LNS was because we do need, it's one of the critical bridges that we need to build between community and labor. And I think Just Transition is really at the center of both the tensions and the opportunities in terms of what we can do in regards to addressing just transition. So I'm just going to try to make a couple of major points in my time. One is that the concept of just transition is still evolving. And I'm going to refer a lot of, my comments are going to come a lot of the report that we developed last year that came out of the Grassroots Policy Institute and Labor Network for Sustainability, called Just Transition, Just What Is It? Because like a number of other people, we're trying to figure out how are people really talking about this now? What's the current state of the conversations around just transition, and how do we move forward around that concept? And then the second point is to talk about how it is a contentious issue right now, just transition, because we need to really get to the core of some of these tensions and figure out how we move beyond them. And then I'll say a little bit, I was asked to talk a little bit about the difference in terms of how just transition is looked at between my previous work at CJA and today at LNS. So oddly enough, the roots of the idea of just transition go back to the GI Bill. The GI Bill after World War II was provided 4 years of tuition and living wage to all, well, not all the soldiers. That's another thing we got to look at. Just the GI Bill is actually also contentious because a lot of communities of color didn't have access to the benefits of the GI Bill, and that actually led to a number of civil rights organizations being founded. But it was a program that was very comprehensive that provided for soldiers coming back from the war to transition back to what was supposed to be a peacetime economy. Tony Mazzocchi, he was the leader of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union in the 70s. He was a World War II veteran, and he at first wanted to apply the concept of the GI Bill to nuclear disarmament, because the nuclear disarmament movement was very strong in the 70s and 80s. Being the president of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, he recognized that, that they were going to need to transition out of those weapons manufacturing industries, and therefore he called for a similar type of GI Bill for workers in that industry. As global warming became more, the awareness of global warming started to emerge, particularly in the 1990s. The Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union applied that concept then to those workers that were going to have to transition out of fossil fuel industries. And initially they called it a Superfund for workers. Remember, the Superfund program was a federal program to clean up the most polluted sites around the country. OCAW was basically saying we need the same thing for workers that are going to have to leave their jobs in the fossil fuel industries in the interest of protecting the planet and the environment. So eventually the term changed. Some environmentalists felt that the term Superfund was too tainted, so they changed the concept to just transition, and it's been in existence ever since, and has kind of been taken up at the national level, and as Sam referred to, even at the international level, being written into the Paris Agreement as well. Les Leopold, who's a labor writer, he's with the Labor Institute, said that the basis for just transition is the simple principle of equity. Said that no toxic related workers should be asked to pay a disproportionate tax in the form of losing his or her job to achieve the goals of environmental protection. Instead, these costs should be fairly distributed across society. So that was the original conception of just transition. It was very much focused on workers losing their jobs and making sure that they weren't left hanging. And then Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers started an initiative in the late 1990s with environmental justice groups. At that time, there were a number of national or regional environmental justice networks. And they started a collaborative, basically working with folks on what they refer to as both sides of the fence line. So how do we get workers in these plants and members of the community together for a common agenda to protect the health and safety of the community, and at the same time support the rights of workers inside the plant. So they did a number of innovative programs in a handful of cities in the United States, and actually small towns in places like Arizona and Richmond, California, and other places. Unfortunately, when one of the first mergers happened, where OCAW basically was merged with the Paper Mill Workers Union, that program was terminated. So that the Just Transition Alliance that emerged out of that still exists today, but the active leadership by the president of the union at that time, Bob Wages, that really ended at that time. But the concept still continued on and grew. And now, as many of you know, the Climate Justice Alliance is one of the groups that's really helped to popularize kind of a broader conception of just transition. And EDGE Funders has some great resources. You know, on the website, there's a video there, a great video that talks about the definition of economy and ecology, and really looking at transition as more of a full spectrum transition that transforms relationships in terms of labor, our relationships to nature and people and government into regenerative relationships rather than what we talk about as extractive relationships. So I think it's a really, it's a beautiful conception really of what the transition is that we really need. And more, as of course, as the clock is ticking towards 2050 and, and as the ice sheets continue to melt in the Arctic and Greenland, I think we're under pressure more and more to actually have more of a transformational type of just transition. And I think that's what the CJA conception speaks to. And very recently, they just released Just Transition Principles as well that should be available through CJA and their website there, which I think are a really good set of principles. So the controversy, though, about just transition is really the fact that, in the words of one of the union leaders, basically says that, well, we haven't really seen one, right? We've never seen a just transition actually take place. And Richard Trumka, the current president of the AFL-CIO, calls it an invitation to a fancy funeral for the labor movement. You know, folks like Brad Markell, who's the head of the industrial division of the AFL-CIO, says that 1/4 of the coal industry has been put out of business, but there's been nothing for coal workers in that transition. So he says any transition has to be made real. It can't just be this ideal that we're working towards. There has to be something real for workers on the other end. We could also look, you know, the Green Jobs program. There was a lot of training that was provided for workers to take on green jobs, but not a lot of jobs that were actually on the other end of that. And then probably, I think one of the most mass examples that we have of a transition is NAFTA. And, you know, and the fact that millions of workers were put out of manufacturing jobs in the United States, millions of workers are agricultural communities, farmers and peasants in Mexico were displaced. So everybody lost through NAFTA, and there wasn't a transition to actually account for and take care of those workers and people that lost their jobs and livelihoods through NAFTA. So those are just, I think, real clear examples as to why there's skepticism within the labor movement, and rightfully so. But that being said, the idea, whether we're using the term just transition, because in some places in the labor movement, you cannot even use the term. You'll get doors closed to you. In North Carolina, we had an organizer who was trying to start a roundtable of environmentalists, EJ people, and labor people, and they could not name the roundtable a just transition roundtable. That was the first name they wanted to use. They had to change it to climate and jobs. And so we're seeing that in a number of places in the labor movement, where talking about just transition is not a good way to start the conversation. But it's clear, more and more clear, that we need one, whether we call it that or not. We have to not only think about how we are a carbon neutral and developing a carbon neutral economy, but we have to actually think about how do we develop a carbon negative economy, which means that we also have to change other systems, agriculture, transportation. It has to be really a full spectrum transition. And there also has to be meaningful work, right? That's one of the principles CJA talks about. I like to talk about it as, you know, people like to create, they like to construct, and they like to contribute, right? And so they want work that actually allows them to do those things, that makes them feel like human beings and not just, you know, a part of a machine on an assembly line. So just transition really provides now a lot of opportunities. And I think one of the things, you know, we can talk about this Paris moment with can't even say his name, pulling out of the Paris Agreement. But it's also, I like to think of it as a Pittsburgh moment. The fact that the next day, you know, within hours of Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement, Leo Gerard, the head of the steelworkers, wrote a really great op-ed about Pittsburgh and what it was like before environmental regulations. The next day, the city of Pittsburgh declared that they're going to go to 100% renewable energy. I think that, to me, was really significant. And more we're seeing cities jumping on board in the US and around the world to make this commitment. But it can be done the right way, and it can be done the wrong way. And I think these commitments provide an opportunity for us to build the kind of coalitions that we need for the transitions to happen in the right way. And it's not going to happen in the right way if we don't have environmental justice, indigenous people, farm workers, unions, that we need really broad-based coalitions coming together to really define the vision for what that transition looks like. Otherwise, it could be just another privatization, you know, a giveaway to corporations to do this kind of transition. So, so anyway, we're going to get more and more into this discussion later, but in terms of how we get there. But I think maybe I'll just stop there. I think there's a lot more we can get into, but really want to get into the conversation. So I just want to thank you all again for joining us, and I look forward to talking to you more. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And I realized with all our preparation, I forgot to communicate with all the speakers how they would know when their time was up. So please look in the chat box. I'll send you a little message saying you've got 1 minute, okay? So thanks, that was great. Next, we will hear from Edouard Marina, he's an author and a lecturer at the University of London Institute in Paris. He did his PhD research on a French farmers movement linked to La Via Campesina, and he studies the intersection between labor, sustainability, and policy on an international level. And he's also written about philanthropy's role in international climate policy. So that was a really great background, Michael. And now Edouard, I think, is going to zoom out and give us a different perspective. So thank you so much. You got 10 minutes.
Okay, hi. Well, thank you, Samantha, for organizing this webinar. So I'm going to, as you say, zoom out a bit. And focus more on the international level, which I've been interested in for a number of years now, focusing on how the just transition concept emerged and developed at the international level. And in particular, I'll focus on the role of the international labor movement, and more specifically, the role of the International Trade Unions Confederation in promoting the just transition concept in the international or the global kind of climate negotiation space. And in a second, well, after having done that, I think I'll focus on, well, drawing on what has been said by Michael and on research that I've conducted. I will tentatively try to kind of come up with categories of just transition approaches. I suppose that's what academics spend their time doing. So I'm going to try and do that. I mean, and then finally, I'll just end by saying why I'm interested in just transition concept and why I feel it's kind of a useful concept for people engaged in various movements or various issues related to climate justice, environmental justice, etc. So I'll just switch over to a brief PowerPoint presentation. See if I can do that. So, okay. Right. Okay. So just transition in the kind of global policy space, more specifically the kind of global climate space. Well, if you kind of look at the history of, I mean, as you just noted, the just transition concept is included in the Paris Climate Agreement, in the preamble of that agreement. And I suppose the reason why it is included in the agreement, it has largely to do with the actions and mobilizations of the international labor movement, and more specifically the International Trade Union Confederation. And so I suppose the question I ask myself is why, I mean, did the International Trade Union Confederation choose to kind of focus on this just transition concept? Now, if we look at the late 1990s, so the beginnings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, you have kind of a first phase in which the international labor movement is actively trying to engage in the sustainable development and international environmental debate. And so what we see at the end of the 1990s during this first phase, which lasts more or less until the COP15 in Copenhagen, is a lot of work being done within the international trade union movement to mainstream environmental issues. And they do so, and the just transition concept is basically a tool for the international labor movement to kind of mainstream environmental issues. And so you could say that during this first kind of greening the environmental movement, getting in environmental debates, and more specifically in the international climate debate.
Edouard, can you repeat that last sentence? You kind of
yeah.
jumped out a bit.
Sorry.
That's okay. No, not your fault.
So the first, as I said, this first phase, which kind of lasts from the mid-1990s to Copenhagen to 2009, is really about the international trade union movement mainstreaming kind of environmental and climate issues within the movement. And the just transition concept is a really useful tool to do that. Because, as Michael highlighted, it's a concept that was born out of the labor movement. And so the fact that it is a trade union concept really facilitates this work of greening the movement. A second phase, you could say, is the second phase goes from the kind of 2009 to the Copenhagen conference to Paris, more or less. And that second phase is really about reinforcing and building bridges between the international labor movement and other organizations or other stakeholders in the international climate debate, whether they be NGOs, whether they be even business representatives. And so there again, the kind of just transition concept actually serves as a tool to kind of build bridges between the international labor movement and other groups involved in the international climate debate. And that's facilitated by the global kind of economic context. 2008 is the beginning of the kind of big global economic crisis. And so there is this kind of new interest in concepts that were mentioned by Michael, such as the green economy, on this kind of connection between acting upon the environment and creating jobs in kind of a difficult economic context. And so that really facilitates this bridging work that's being done during that period. And the high point, which is the kind of a result of the actions of the International Trade Union Confederation in particular, is the inclusion of the just transition in the Paris Accord. And so the third phase is the kind of post-2015 kind of context. And you could say that since the Paris Climate Conference, what we're seeing is kind of a mainstreaming of just transition in not only international climate circles, but broader circles involved in kind of sustainable development debates or environmental debate more generally. And so a wide range of actors are now referring to the just transition concept in their work. And that has even been strengthened more recently by the victory of Donald Trump in the elections, because effectively his campaign was partly built on this opposition between, on the one hand, jobs and the environment. And so the just transition concept is seen as a tool to kind of counter that jobs versus environment discourse. Now, having said this, what we're seeing is kind of the emergence of different kind of approaches, you could say, or different understandings of what the kind of just transition concept stands for. Now, again, this is a very tentative attempt to kind of classify these approaches, but hopefully this will kind of contribute to the discussion that we'll be having. So I kind of identified three kind of main approaches or understandings. The first I would kind of qualify as kind of a liberal environmentalist approach, which really builds upon the kind of green growth, green economy kind of discourse that emerged from 2010, 2011 onwards. And that approach is really views the just transition as being basically about jobs. So it's about replacing dirty jobs by green jobs. And what you're seeing with this approach is that it's particularly used with reference to the coal sector, for instance. So how do we shift away from coal, from dirty energy? We need to get rid of the dirty coal jobs and create new green ones. And so the key stakeholders in that debate, in that approach, I would argue, are more kind of businesses and investors, but also to a certain degree, kind of mayors of big cities. Just recently, Mayor Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies have kind of engaged in this discussion as well. And their view, they promote a kind of a bottom-up approach, you could say, in the sense that they consider that businesses, investors, subnational local governments have kind of a major role to play in this shift away from dirty jobs to green jobs. And what's generally associated with this approach, I would argue, is also a kind of a technology-driven and kind of market-driven approach to change. So it's not about challenging, again, the existing social economic order. So it's not really about systemic change, but at the same time, it is about a just transition to a certain extent. The second approach is what I qualify the kind of social reformist one, which you could say is I would associate with the trade union movement and the international trade union movement in particular. And they promote an idea that it's not just about creating green jobs, it's also about creating good, decent jobs. Unionized jobs, jobs that improve the livelihoods of workers and their communities. And I suppose there is a certain degree of systemic thinking there in that it kind of fits into kind of this general idea that we need a more kind of socially just society or economically just society. In terms of the kind of vectors of change, besides kind of unions and workers, movements, they also view kind of generally, maybe in the case of Europe, it's particularly visible. I know less about the US, but the state or the federal state or the government plays an important role in their approach to the just transition. The final approach I would qualify as kind of a grassroots kind of systems change approach, which not only focuses on jobs, but on kind of wider economic and political systems. And so, this means including a variety of different issues, social, racial, gender justice issues. And so it's also about challenging existing power relations. And it's also about bottom-up action. So it's very community-centered, or frontline communities, community-driven change, which is promoted through this approach. And it also tends to promote very concrete solutions. So it's not just about government policies, it's also about taking matters into our own hands, in a sense, to a certain degree. And so, given these differences in approaches, I would actually argue that they are not, they're not incompatible, but there is actually a certain level of compatibility between them. Because the just transition concept itself is, what I would qualify a kind of a bridging concept. It's this kind of idea that it's not about, the just transition is not kind of an end in itself, but a means to an end. And this idea of transition is very important because it's this kind of idea of movement, this idea that it's kind of a work in progress. And so that, I think, I feel that the just transition's added value is that it actually facilitates the kind of coming together of very different constituencies, of people with actually very different understandings of justice, different levels of engagement, different approaches to change as well. And that touches on an essential issue if we are to successfully address the world's most pressing problems. And that issue, I think, is inclusiveness. So it's really about getting the most vulnerable, the least politically savvy, and the least mobilized to engage with important issues, questions of our day. And so, I think I'll stop there. Am I more or less okay in terms of time?
Yeah, you have 30 seconds, actually.
Okay.
So you want to use them?
I hand them over to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. That was great. So next, I'm not sure who's going to go first, but we'll hear from both Laura Rapira and Marianne Elliott from Action Station in New Zealand. Respectively, Laura, they are the Director of Campaigns, that's Laura, and Director of Story and Strategy, that's Marianne at Action Station, which has brought together over 100,000 New Zealanders to take action toward a flourishing future. Action Station builds movements out of movement moments and helps break down silos between issues like climate, mental health issues, public interest broadcasting, defending freshwater, and more. So Laura and Marianne can take it away, and they will share with us some of the intersectionality that they're working with all the way over on the other side of the globe. So thank you for joining us. Who wants to go first?
We're going to be presenting at the same time, but I'll be sharing my screen, so I'll just share that.
Okay, so you actually have 20 minutes since there are two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Get Laura's screen.
I'm wondering.
At the bottom, Laura, you can, oh yeah, now we can see your screen.
Now that means I can't see you is the only thing.
Oh, okay. So you can't see the people.
No,
Okay.
but that's okay. That's all right. All right. Apologies, we're a bit slower than the others where it's 4:30 a.m. here at the moment.
No apology needed.
Well, I'll kick off. And kia ora and morena from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Marianne. And so Action Station, as Sam said, is an independent, mostly crowd-funded campaigning organisation that currently has actually a community of over 170,000 New Zealanders who act together to create what none of us could do on our own, which is a society, economy, and democracy that will serve all of us, everyday people, and the planet we love. That's the core idea. So like the EDGE funders, we respond to overlapping issues and overlapping opportunities across economic and environmental justice, human rights, and democracy. And on any given day, Laura and I might be working on campaigns related to refugees, fresh water, race or gender justice issues, or mental health, for example. Part of our core theory of change is that we can build a bigger movement and a bigger momentum for transformative change. So that big movement that it's going to take to create this sort of transformative change that I think we all are talking about this morning, by connecting up the movements and the hot moments on each of these different issues, and helping people have an experience or an insight into how they are related to each other and what the values are and the more transformative vision is that underpins them all. So all of our campaigns are not only designed to get specific political results, although they are also designed and in a way that will build confidence, agency and power in the everyday people who take action on the issues that they care about. So every campaign strategy that we develop must, as well as having a strategy that we hope will achieve the specific goal of policy change or legislative change or whatever that might be, we also ask, how would this campaign build sustained power and capacity in our communities? And in order to do that, we work with individuals, community groups, unions, social movements, and traditional NGOs.
And I've included this slide here because I am a millennial, and it's Action Station's work basically described in emojis, which is that we combine the power of digital tools to organize large and small groups of people to combine their skills, their money, their ideas, their time, their energy, creativity, and voice for a more fair and flourishing future and world. This slide here gives you a kind of idea of what an action station type of person looks like. So it's not about someone's income or activist history or how many committees they've sat on or ethnic background or whatever it is. It's a shared sense of values. And this is what it looks like. One of their profiles would look like in the back end of our system. And you'll see that they have a lot of tags associated to them, which means that they've taken action on a lot of different campaigns with us, everything from working to end homelessness in New Zealand to improving the public mental health system to taking action to increase funding for sexual violence support and prevention. And so this is the ideal type of Action Station person. And the service that we offer to people like this is that we give them opportunities to take action on the things that they care about, and we put huge emphasis on the values between those seemingly disparate individual issues, and we don't kind of speak to people in issue silos at all. And one of the ways we practically do that, for example, a lot of our organizing is done through our email list, is we have something that we call the Netflix recommendation model. And that means it's something like, oh, hey, you took action on an issue around welcoming more refugees into New Zealand, which is fundamentally at its core about justice and people having the ability to have self-determination and create their own future and world. How would you like to take action on this issue around homelessness in New Zealand, which is fundamentally about the same kind of issue? So making those connections for people where they otherwise might not be able to have the opportunity to make those connections so easily. The other thing that we practice in our work every day is we have what's called, and some of you might be familiar with this terminology, low floor, high ceiling, and wide walls, which means that we keep the barrier for entry for participation really, really low. So if the only thing that you have to give towards this movement is signing an occasional online petition, then that is great. But we want to give you opportunities to take further, deeper actions if you so wish to, and that's what we mean about the high ceiling. And so part of our job is curating opportunities for people to take action after they sign the online petition, and that might be make a phone call to your local decision maker, send an email, make a submission, donate to this crowd-funded creative tactic that we're going to be using, turn out to a rally or whatever it might be. And so that really speaks to the wide walls, which is giving people ample opportunities to contribute whatever it is that they have from wherever they are. And so where that has led us to is that Action Station is 3 years old, and in that time we've collected 450,000 petition signatures from New Zealanders. 20,000 people have made individual submissions to Parliament, and so that's not what a lot of organisations that you may think of, where they create kind of a pre-templated form where people then just go and add their email to a pre-templated form and send that off. Those are 20,000 individual submissions that we've supported people to make through the kind of democratic processes, I guess, that already exist within our system. We're just making it easier and giving people the information that they need to make an informed submission. We've also facilitated 35,000 emails and calls to decision makers through our website. And as Marianne alluded to, we're mostly a crowd-funded organisation with an average donation of about $21. And that has, totaled to 400,000 in the kind of, in the last little while, last couple of years. Over to you, Marianne.
Great. So we're just going to talk very briefly about two of the different campaigns we've worked on in the past 3 years. The first one is the one about refugees, because it was a challenging campaign in lots and lots of ways. And there's a few key lessons that we learned from this about these three core things around movements, moments, and messaging. So this was a campaign that we picked up when we were approached by a grassroots campaigning organisation in New Zealand that had just been started by some New Zealanders who were really concerned about the state of the sort of global refugee crisis. And we worked with them on it, providing sort of strategy and digital and connecting them to the wider Action Station community for about 9 months with very little traction. And then there was a moment, and there was a moment when a media story broke globally around the world, and it certainly had a very big impact in New Zealand, where there was an image of a little boy on a beach, and probably many of you remember that moment. And in that moment, this campaign found its space in the sort of hearts and minds of New Zealanders. So it was a really strong lesson for us in this theory of change that we carry, that, you know, if we are able to move quickly and to use digital tools to sort of convert these moments into wider, take them to wider audiences and give people something to do in those moments, that then and then follow up and give them something to do next and connect them up with other people who care about that same issue. You can help build a movement out of a moment like that. We also learned a lot about the importance of messaging and ensuring that every message that we use in every campaign is embedded in the core values that underlie our entire transformative vision, because it's very easy otherwise to sort of slip into messages or frames for a specific campaign that actually don't carry you towards that transformative vision. The specific outcome of this campaign was that the New Zealand government announced an emergency intake of refugees from Syria. That happened the week that we, together with this grassroots movement and traditional NGOs like Amnesty and Red Cross, we'd hosted vigils across New Zealand. Then we kept the campaign going, and the government announced an increase in our ongoing quota of refugees that come into New Zealand. And now we're leading up to an election, and what is, you know, something that I probably don't think could have been imagined, and certainly has not happened previously in the last 3 decades. We have political parties announcing, as part of their election platform, their commitment to double or even quadruple our refugee quota. So then a very different campaign was the campaigning that we did in New Zealand around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which had a very different political life in New Zealand to the life that it had in other countries and across Europe with the TTIP and in the United States. What we found by connecting into our community of members and the grassroots organisations that we work with was that there were some very, very strongly held concerns in New Zealand about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, including whether entering this agreement would limit the New Zealand government's ability to regulate and legislate to protect our natural environment and our labour rights. That was a very significant concern. And there was also quite a lot of concern in New Zealand about whether the extension of patents in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so that's the extension of pharmaceutical patents, would make it harder to access generic drugs, which would place some sort of an unsustainable strain on our public health system. And finally, there was real concern about threats under the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement to Indigenous intellectual property and to the right to sovereignty that is granted, or not granted, but guaranteed to Indigenous people of New Zealand under our Treaty of Waitangi, which we'll talk about in a minute. What happened in New Zealand is that the government insisted on dismissing all concerns about this trade deal as being anti-trade or anti-globalization, protectionist, or at its worst. They tried to dismiss these concerns as coming from a place that was xenophobic. And what this meant was that the people who were concerned about the Trans-Pacific Partnership for all of these reasons that I've just listed ended up feeling more supported by, or ran the risk of feeling more supported by, and therefore becoming politically supportive of the political parties who in fact were opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement for these sort of protectionist and xenophobic reasons. So what we did was to try and create a space and a movement for people to express their concerns to the government about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but framed around these kind of just issues, these issues of justice, these issues around sovereignty, around the ability of New Zealand to protect our resources. We worked with unions, we worked with grassroots organisations, we worked with other campaigning organisations, and our role specifically, Laura did a ton of work on this campaign, but some of the things that we did specifically included crowdfunding a website with facts about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that was just a place where people could go and get a whole lot of information, and we created really easy, shareable digital tools that people could share across social media just to help answer some of the questions people had about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then we crowdsourced a submission. So we had a select committee, a group of members of Parliament in New Zealand who were going to be reviewing the Trans-Pacific Partnership before New Zealand signed on. And we put together a submission, which, if I remember rightly, Laura, had thousands, or several thousand, maybe 3,000 people submitted to it. And we crowdsourced it, put it all together and took it and presented it to the committee. We had a whole lot of people come along with us and fill the room to sit with us. We had a video with photos of people from all around the country with all of their different concerns. And we were able to bring those concerns of New Zealanders into the room and give those people a place to be part of a movement and to have their concerns heard and to feel that they were part of something other than as I say, the sort of political mileage that was being made by certain kind of those nationalist, protectionist political parties in New Zealand. So I'll hand over back to Laura.
Cool. And so in the 3 short years that Action Station has existed, we've been able to play a really pivotal role, and it's never just us alone. And I want to emphasize that 90% of Action Station's campaigns are run in collaboration with either a small NGO or a grassroots group or a large NGO, large traditional NGO, or a subject matter expert or academics or people in frontline communities with lived experience. But through some of these collaborations in our campaign work, we've increased core benefit levels in New Zealand for the first time in 30 years. We helped secure a boost of $46 million in funding towards sexual violence support and prevention, which is a huge problem in New Zealand. We also successfully campaigned for raising the age of state foster care in New Zealand from 17 to 21, which that gap was actually a huge contributor to youth homelessness and youth suicide in New Zealand, which is a really big problem. We have one of the highest rates of youth suicide in the OECD. And we also secured the first increase in public broadcasting funding in 8 years. And so just from those kind of successes, you can see the wide range of issues that our community take action on. Yeah. Over to you, Marianne. Oh, did I lose Marianne? Well, I can speak to this. So one of the inherent challenges of this multi-issue movement of movements approach and bringing people together is that more often than not, the government does respond to people power. We have a government who's very, very fond of putting a lot of money into polling. And when we are able to rally public support enough around an issue that we have put on the political agenda and then brought the majority of New Zealanders onto our side, that will show up in their polling. And so often what they do is they do the bare minimum that they need to kind of appease the New Zealand public whilst effectively maintaining the status quo. And so that leaves very little space for any kind of transformative ideas in the political space in New Zealand. And even the parties here that are founded in transformational ideas and values, they end up sort of framing their policies and their ideas in terms of in terms of economic growth, for example. And so 3 years into our life cycle as a movement, we're coming to realize that we need to introduce a space for more transformational change to be able to happen. And because our opposition political parties aren't offering that, we want that to come from our growing community, which now has about 5% of the voter share, which in New Zealand politics would be enough to have a seat, which is great. And so recognizing the sort of need for us to rise above party politics and look at long-term transformational change, we've decided, because it's an election year here in New Zealand, that we're going to be organising members of our community to come together to have a conversation about where we want to be in 2040. So 23 years from now. And the reason we've picked 2040 is because it's 200 years since the founding document of British settlement in New Zealand was signed, which is called the Treaty of Waitangi. And some quick context here is that the challenge is that in 1840, Māori rangatira, or chiefs, signed a different version of the treaty than British settlers. So one was in English and one was in Māori. And there were huge translational differences, and that has been a source of much upheaval over the years and discontent. The English version of the treaty basically assigns full sovereignty of New Zealand to the British Crown. The Māori version retains that sovereignty for Māori, but gives the British Crown rule over British subjects living in New Zealand. And so our election project is focused on how do we, over the next 23 years, reorient our society, our economy, and our democracy towards being a post-colonial country that honours the true intention of the treaty, while recognising that increasingly, and even right now, New Zealand is one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world, and we need to make space for a multicultural country.
Sorry, I'm back, Laura. I disappeared on you for a bit there.
That's okay. Do you want to talk about this part?
My internet connection stopped. Yeah, so what we're doing with this project this year is, I think Laura's probably done all the setup for this, is we are going to work together to create what we're calling Te Ere Tangata, a crowdsourced vision for New Zealand in 2040, or the People's Agenda for Aotearoa New Zealand. So we want to produce this bold, alternative, multifaceted vision for the transformative path we need to go down together to get to a fair and flourishing future for Aotearoa New Zealand. And the way that we've decided to do that is something quite old-fashioned. We want to get people together over food all over the country. So we're inviting members of our community to host meals, and at these meals we provide them with a host guide that helps them to host a conversation, and that conversation is embedded in values. So we start the conversation by connecting with people on having people connect with each other on the basis of the places that are precious to them in Aotearoa New Zealand, and then we have a conversation that's really grounded in a set of values that have been drawn both from Tikanga Māori and from research around values around the world. So these dinners, these meals, hopefully we've already started, and hopefully they'll continue over the next few months to happen all over the country. And they will, out of that, we'll we'll have surveys where people can give us the data back from these dinners, and we'll also be gathering data in other ways and to supplement these conversations that happen over food, by, you know, obviously by taking advice from wise heads all over the country about what the future of New Zealand should be. And then once we've created the vision, we'll use that crowdsourced vision for 2040 in New Zealand, which to get out the vote this year. So we'll be sending this crowdsourced vision, the People's Agenda, to all the political parties and asking them to respond to a set of specific questions about how close their policies are to the policies or the vision of the People's Agenda. And then we'll help people have conversations with their members of parliament once the new government is in place. So that's the People's Agenda. We're calling the bulk of this project is called Kai and Kōrero. Kai is Māori for food, and Kōrero is for conversation. And we're really hoping that it's an opportunity for people to come together who might be, you know, people who might be predominantly seeing the world through one lens, whether that lens is environmental protection or labour rights or gender justice, but through these value-based conversations to start to see how all those issues are connected up with each other and how we can build a vision for the future that is grounded in our shared values and sees all of those issues being transformed. That's the goal.
Okay. Thank you so much, Laura and Marianne. That was incredible, especially considering the hour. Thank you very, very much. So I hope that everyone listening can stick with us for a little bit, because we have a couple of great questions that have come in. I had some discussion points that the group talked about when we were on the phone together before, but I think I'm going to start with a question that came from the audience, because it's been repeated a couple of times. So it was specifically both for Michael and Eduard, but Laura and Marianne, I welcome you to answer this as well. So the question for Eduard was, looking at the slide on grassroots-based just transition and systems change compared to liberal or liberal environmentalist or social reformist, that slide, it said that the grassroots-based one wasn't just about government policy, but sought concrete solutions, taking matters into their own hands. So the question is, could you elaborate and give a few examples? And then there was a similar question for Michael, asking for elaboration and examples of some really great concrete just transition work going on the ground. And Laura and Marianne, I'm guessing that you have some that you could share as well. So let's start with Michael. Let's go in the order that the speakers spoke, and then Michael, Eduard, and then Laura and Marianne, if you'd like to contribute too.
Well, one of the things we're doing at the Labor Network for Sustainability is trying to basically connect up those folks throughout the labor movement that are concerned about climate or are already doing work around climate. So, you know, I've just been really pleasantly surprised just to see a number of different initiatives that are taking place. One of the unions, I think, that's really taking the lead on a lot of projects, renewable projects, is the IBEW, and particularly there's a number of locals in places like New York, Local 3 in California, Local 11 in Los Angeles and San Diego and San Luis Obispo, where they're getting involved in organizing for renewable energy programs and also for public transportation infrastructure. And so it's just great to see, particularly because IBEW is a building trades union, and as many people know, there's a lot of the resistance and the tensions within the labor movement around fossil fuels and climate change issues is within the building trades. So to see IBEW out in the lead on this is great to see. One example I'll give is, in particular, is in San Luis Obispo, where Friends of the Earth was involved with the local IBEW there on shutting down the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. And out of that, they negotiated a long-term transition agreement that invests $350 million for the workers, and also maintains a tax commitment by PG&E, the corporation, into San Luis Obispo, into the local government. So so it's not, you know, the transformational approach necessarily we're looking for, but it does demonstrate that within the labor movement, there's a lot of potential and interest. And I think particularly Local 1245 is really interested in more of a transformational approach around just transition, and looking very proactively at how to transition the economy rather than just a straight replacement of jobs for the workers. So.
Okay, thank you. Edouard, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think there was a slight problem with my internet connection, so I missed the beginning of the question, but I think I got the gist of it.
Basically, yeah, about taking matters into their own hands. Can you elaborate and give examples what that means? And now you're frozen. Can we hear you?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, again, I don't know if it's my connection or what. Yeah, I mean, so about taking matters into your own hands. I mean, I suppose examples I know about. I mean, kind of concrete examples. One concrete example in France is, for instance, there's this small town in north of France.
Edouard, we're having trouble hearing you, unfortunately.
Dunkerque, so called Grande Sainte, for instance, and for school camps. Hello, yeah. They've also been promoting kind of retrofitting for homes. So the government has been kind of supporting local businesses, in particular in the construction sector, to improve kind of energy efficiency of public housing in the towns. So these are very kind of concrete kind of initiatives that are actually taking place already, that are sometimes not even. They don't actually necessarily refer to themselves as kind of just transition initiatives, but they clearly kind of fit into this kind of framework. So it's kind of this idea that, you know, through very concrete examples, we can make kind of very meaningful changes to the way in which our societies function. And I suppose one of the key characteristics, which I referred to in my talk as well, which I think is really central, is the participatory dimension of all these initiatives. This idea that the idea is really to get local communities involved in the decision making. So they have to be involved. They have to participate in kind of making strategic decisions and in actually getting things done. And so that's something that I think is also very, very interesting to analyze. But I'm sure there are a number of other examples in the US which could probably also kind of fit into this general idea.
Thanks. Thank you. Michael, I see you just unmuted. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit. I think what's impressive about the example that Edouard just gave, and also the Action Station folks, is the level of scale that they're working at, right? And I think that's been one of the challenges we've been facing in the US, is finding examples where we can actually demonstrate a level of scale in a transition. And I think, you know, so a lot of the examples we see are more localized, in a lot of cases very neighborhood based. You know, the vision I know of Climate Justice Alliance was working at the level of cities. And I think that's where we're seeing in the US where there is potential for coalitions where we can start at that local level, but actually scaling up at the speed we need to. I know that's been a challenge and a problem. And I know Kwong just put in a question also about the role of the state and how we see the role of the state. I think in our vision at LNS, we do see the role of the state. We think that there is a role of, you know, for us, it's about how do we build power to influence local, statewide, and eventually nationally, because at the end of the day, we do feel there needs to be a national, a large-scale national effort to make this happen. And I know CGA had a similar vision, but maybe slightly different, where it's reinvestment by the federal government back in local communities. And I think that's, you know, those are questions that we need to resolve. But I think we all recognize in the US, it's going to be tough to get this government at the national level to get the program that we need. So we need to build power where we can and scale up from there.
Okay, thanks. So Laura and Marianne, would you like to respond to the question about, you know, talking a little bit more about concrete work that exemplifies the just transition? And then I also just want to read out, for those of you who don't have access to the text box, the question Michael was referring to says, it seems like there's some work today that does not take into account the state. Do the speakers have any viewpoint about movement work that sees itself as building new infrastructure outside of and separate from the state, and also seeing no real role for the state? So I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Laura and Marianne, but if you want to respond to either of those, the question of the state and the work in relation to it, or good work that you'd just like to highlight that exemplifies what we've been talking about.
Well, maybe I can respond to the first bit, and Laura might want to say something about the second bit. Obviously, you know, well, I would say personally, and I think we have a shared sort of vision at Action Station that we need change to be happening at all of these levels, and that you need communities to be building solutions that work for communities, and that they need to be supported and resourced to do that. Our focus is very much on building political power in a way that could create a transformation of the way that the state operates in relation to these issues. That's certainly not to say that at some point that movement of political power might start to have the possibility to operate in ways that are, you know, some sort of alternative to current systems. But for now, a lot of our focus is on, it's not exclusively on, but a lot of our focus is on building political power for these movements of ordinary, you know, different everyday New Zealanders and grassroots movements. And so we are quite focused on the role of the state. I was just thinking there's two things that might be interestingly sort of unique to New Zealand, not completely unique, but they are distinctive of the New Zealand political environment. One is the history of Te Tiriti o Waitangi that Laura already mentioned. And so under the treaty, there is certainly sort of reserved to Māori in New Zealand the right to have these sort of alternative and parallel structures and systems for building the solutions to the issues that are identified by and experienced by Māori people. But I would say that, you know, part of our idea of building political power would be building political power to ensure that those initiatives are properly supported by the state. And then the second thing would be, we do have a really strong history in New Zealand of state, of the state's role in social issues. So of course we have, you know, a strong history of a social welfare system, a public health system, a public education system. So these levers of public policy around issues like health and education are incredibly powerful in terms of shifting social justice issues. So, you know, that might be different in different countries, there are different traditions. So for us, I would say there are these two factors, one around the importance, the right, and the need to support alternative and parallel structures that, for Māori, and then the other being, you know, the fact that we have good, strong traditions of state-funded public services that I think New Zealanders feel very strongly that a lot of solutions lie in reorienting those. Laura, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think in New Zealand there's very rich and fertile soil for at least crowdfunding initiatives from the community up to kind of fulfill your own needs. So recently when we had an earthquake in Kaikoura, which is in the South Island, enormous amounts of money was raised to help communities rebuild, and like to the extent that it was like crowdfund money for emergency food, but also for rebuilding the infrastructure and things like that. And I think that while I think that is really incredible, because they also did things like, while seeing as things have been broken, let's crowdfund for renewable energy at the local community centre, let's have solar panels and things like that. While I think that is amazing, I worry to some extent that it is essentially it's a replacement of what the state should actually do. Like the state should be providing funding for communities to rebuild. And so I think there is incredibly rich opportunity that exists for community powered solutions, but I don't want it to be at the expense of state getting away with doing what they should actually do for people in the first place.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. So, I hope everybody knows I've been sending little notes in the text box that if you have a question, please type it in the box and I'll read it out. But we're winding down to the end, and I just want to make sure that we get to one question that I posed to the group when we were talking the other day. Because this is a largely funder audience, the question to anybody, any of the four of you who want to jump in your experiences, how has philanthropy engaged in systems change work? And do you have any advice for funders, particularly for those who might be working in strict program silos? And actually, if there's anyone in the audience who would like to answer that question too, feel free to just type your desire to speak in the text box and you can unmute yourself. But let's start first with our speakers. Edouard, Michael, Laura, Marianne, anybody? Bueller?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't got maybe that much to say on how funders have engaged in systems change work. I suppose based on the research I've conducted on funders in general, I see the role that they seem to have is, especially given, I suppose, what I presented, this kind of idea that for me, I really see the role of funders as also kind of playing a kind of convening role, kind of bringing, they have this kind of capacity to bring very different actors together around the table and around a given subject. And so I suppose that's why I was interested in the EDGE initiative, because I really see it as a kind of a unique kind of platform for discussion and for exchange. For people who have maybe different approaches or different understandings of what the just transition means, to actually engage in a conversation. And I think that from that, there are a number of synergies that can emerge. And I suppose this, I wanted to also bounce back on this issue of the state, which I suppose relates to this.
Oh, Edouard, we just lost you again.
What I see is that, in fact, sorry, yeah, I'm very sorry about my connection.
No, that's okay.
Maybe if I turn the video off. Okay. Yeah, I mean, what I really see is that foundations through the groups that they fund and through the networks that they have this kind of ability to bring people who have maybe different approaches to just transition together. For instance, I really see kind of a compatibility between the work being done at the community level and work being done more at the national level for kind of pushing for policy. I mean, examples, an interesting example, I mean, it might be imperfect, but for instance, the example of the Just Transition Fund in the US, or the work being done in Europe around a Just Transition Fund, being pushed at the European level and at the EU level, I really see kind of connections between the kind of policy level at the European or US federal level and the kind of community level, because local communities will be able to tap into these federal funds or into these European funds in order to push through some of these kind of just transition initiatives. And that's coming back to this issue of the role of philanthropy. Well, I really see it as kind of acting as a bridge between these different approaches, and then facilitating this dialogue for groups who are active at the community level to realize that they can also depend on, or they can also use the work being done at the kind of supranational level or national level to actually push forward their demands.
Can I maybe follow up with that with an example of that, Sam?
Yeah, definitely, please.
So there's three things that came to my mind, and the first is very similar to what Edouard was saying. So in New Zealand, Action Station has a funding relationship. Most of our funding comes from small donations from members of the community who are participating in these campaigns, but we do have a grant from a funder in New Zealand called the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, and the way that they do this convening, which I think is really powerful. So every 6 months, rather than having us write reports, they bring all of the grant recipients who are operating in the southern part of the island, and they bring us into a room and we sit together and we talk about the work that we're doing. And the last time I was at it, almost every single organization in the room came up to me afterwards and said, okay, we need to do something with Action Station. We're battling away out here in Porirua, which is a city near Wellington, on housing issues, and we're trying to get Pacifica families into houses, and we're doing it at the community level, but we need this policy change. So could you help us sort of mobilize your supporters to campaign around this policy change? So I really think that kind of convening role is incredibly powerful, and it certainly has created connections and relationships and opportunities to work together for us. The second thing is, I would just say that some of the work that we do, some of the issues are much easier to fund. Some of the issues that we campaign on, it's really clear to people, and it's easy for them to see why they matter, or they don't bring up complicated feelings in people, so people's feelings about them are simpler, and those issues are always going to be much easier for us to fund through the kind of crowdfunding model. If we don't have the support of some philanthropists, then we'll only ever be able to campaign on those issues. And the problem is that there are other issues that are incredibly important, and that we find it is possible to mobilize people around them and to, support a kind of transition from moment into a movement around them. But it's really hard to fund those things through crowdfunding. And for example, we find that, whenever we're campaigning around poverty issues, there does seem to be, for people, when they think about poverty, if they have, $5 spare in their budget that week, they probably don't want to give it to a campaign. They might think, actually, I should give that to a food bank, or they want to do something very practical with it. So it's much harder for us to fund our poverty work than it is to fund some of our environmental work. So that's the second thing I think philanthropists can do. They can ensure and support that these cross-issue, sort of multi-issue movements are able to work on all the issues that matter, not just the ones that are easy to fund from the community up. Which I thought that was something that we've found incredibly important in our ability to sustain our work.
Great, thank you. And then I'm just getting in the text box that Joanna, although it's not showing me a last name, Joanna has something to say. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sure. This is Joanna Levitsay at Thousand.
Oh, hi.
Hey, Sam.
Oh, now I see this.
Thank you, everybody, especially those who are up before dawn. And just on this point, I was struck by something, I think, Edward, you pointed out, that just transition by its nature is not a end. It's a means to reach a new kind of world. And I think something that funders can do is really embrace that the process of how we fund and support has to be radically different if we are going to create and transition to like a post-colonial multiculturally inclusive just transition, that to create something we haven't seen yet, we have to have very different kinds of processes to get there. And just two quick things to point to. One is something I've become aware of through research I'm a part of on co-creation for solutions. And a foundation in Wisconsin in the US called Encourage is doing really interesting shifting of power dynamics to hand over decision-making power for grant making to the community and to reimagine what their economy can look like. And I think something we're experimenting with too at Thousand Currents is what's the work that needs to happen on a personal level to be able to practice very new kinds of process.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Joanna. That's really helpful. So we only have 5 minutes left. I'd like to wrap it up. Before we lose too many people, I just want to remind you all again to please go to the EDGE website and check out the Global Engagement Lab application. And you can learn a little bit more about the Just Transition Collaborative and some of the programs that we have that we're launching actually today. So the overarching stuff that's open to a broader community, and then also applications for that global learning and strategy building cohort that will start in November. And I see somebody just posted the link again in the text box, so you can go, you don't even have to do a Google search, you can just go to that link. Thank you so much. I want to give all of our speakers a chance for any final comments. I mean, we did have in some of our talks, and then it came up again today in the past hour and a half, this question of dismantling the old and building the new, and reform versus transform. So if you want, you can speak a little bit to that. How much of a foot can we have in the old while building the new? That was an interesting conversation to me. But if there's something else you'd like to comment on, please, by all means, wrap it up in your own way. And I'll give everybody just 1 minute for some final comments. Let's start with Michael.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thanks, Edge, again, everybody, for being on the call. I actually wanted to speak to the previous question around funding examples. And I'm not familiar with everybody on the call, but just wanted to point out a few key examples. And real quickly, one is Solidago Foundation for years was investing, has been investing in organizing. And I think more and more grassroots organizing that we're seeing today is really fundamental and very important. And I've considered that very transformational in terms of investing in the capacity of communities to organize. I think Grassroots International, 1,000 Currents have been doing great work in connecting communities internationally. I think it really did a lot to inform our work when I was at GGJ and the Climate Justice Alliance as well. And I think Chorus Foundation and what they're doing in their Just Transition investment in deep organizing and coalition building in communities. I think all of those are really good examples of what ultimately is part of supporting the ecosystem that's needed to for transformational change. So I think those are really good examples. I guess I'll leave it at that. I think it is a long conversation on the reform versus transformational part. My quick 2 cents is that we definitely need to get transformational as soon as we can.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, maybe that's the next webinar. Sorry to lob that on you in with 30 seconds. Edouard, do you have any final comments, closing comments?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would be more of, I would kind of argue that, this idea of reform versus transform, I think that, in fact, you could also say reform and transform. I think that the just transition concept leaves quite a lot of space for a variety of different approaches to kind of coexist and to learn from each other. And so, I mean, I think that that's what it kind of, it's really its added value. I think that people, people can initiate a conversation without giving up their hopes or without giving up their projects or their ideas. And I think it's that's why I would argue against trying to define the just transition in any precise way. I think that what's essential is just to highlight the kind of the shared principles basically around which we act. And I think that these principles include the principles of justice, but I think they also include, and I repeat, this kind of principle of inclusivity, trying to get those who suffer the most into this conversation. And I really see the just transition as a useful tool to be able to actually be able to do that.
Great.
Thank you again for the invitation.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. And Laura and Marianne, any closing comments?
No, I just want to say thank you to everyone for the good work that you do in the world. It's always heartening to, sometimes this work can feel very isolated, so it's always very heartening to know that there are lots of people all around the world also working for the just transition to a much better future for all of us.
Marianne? Oh, we may have lost her, unfortunately. Okay, well, thank you all so much for sticking with us. This has been a fabulous conversation. This is the first under the official banner of the Just Transition Collaborative, so I really hope that you join us for the rest. And thanks again, especially to all of our speakers. Really incredible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Sorry, I was on mute at the end there.
Oh, there might still be a few people on if you want to, any last words?
I didn't mean to do anything.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Really great to meet you. I hope we meet in person sometime.